We're looking today at leading in a time of crisis. And I'm really glad to be joined by Peter Shaw, Professor Peter Shaw. Peter will be known to many of you. He's a former Director General in the UK government, an executive coach with extensive experience in public, private and voluntary sectors, working with individuals and teams across 6 continents. He's a visiting professor at institutions of higher education in Britain, Canada and Australia, and has written 28 books on leadership. I'm not on commission, but I've got his latest one here, which I've just started reading, Leadership to the Limits. Really, really good book. And we're delighted that Peter both worships in Busbridge and is a canon at our cathedral. So he's one of ours. So for the first part of the webinar, Peter and I are going to be in conversation, and then there'll be an opportunity for some breakout groups to reflect on what we've spoken about and to ask some questions. So the first question I want to pose to Peter is, how do we define a crisis? Is crisis more of a sudden problem that blows up in our path, or a longer term challenge, an unexpected bump in the road, or a burning platform? Peter.
Crises cause immense pain. And when everyone talks about what might be positives about a crisis, one's always got to preface it by recognizing the pain and anguish that comes out of crises. And maybe a crisis is when there's so much uncertainty that we cannot see a way forward. But out of crises can become new beginnings, because so many things are thrown up in the air, and what was previously impossible can come back on the agenda. Crises often mean that hierarchies disappear, that boundaries fall away, and people have more of a common purpose and therefore will engage more together. It's been drilled into me over the last couple of decades, never waste a good crisis. Crises can be moments of creativity, can bring people together, but underlying it, crisis causes pain and anguish. And that is where we as a church have so much to contribute and say, while at the same time seeking to enable people to look beyond the immediate to what might be possible going forward.
That's incredibly helpful. So what we're focusing on today is how we lead in that time of crisis. We hear a huge amount about leadership these days. What does that mean, Peter, especially in this context?
I've had the privilege over the last 3 months of working with senior leaders in the UK, in North America, and Australia and the Far East. And there's some things really strike me out of those conversations about leaders in the maelstrom, in the uncertainty, in the anguish, in the grief, trying to bring as much clarity as possible. Even when there's uncertainty, bringing clarity about values, seeking to bring as much communication as possible, even if it is to say, I do not know the next steps, but sharing what there is to be shared with a focus on communication seems to me to be the hallmark of those people who are able to lead well in a crisis and take people with them. So it's about clarity, communication, and connectivity, about being able to recognize and empathize with what people in the organization or in that sphere are experiencing. And leading these times, they will often have within their number some people who are absolutely relishing it. A number of people I know are loving working at home, are actually feeling furlough has been a wonderful thing. So there's quite a lot of people for whom this has been an amazing time of working at home, of family time, of furloughing. But for other people, it has been a time of huge grief and anguish and frustration and living in close quarters with people who they find very challenging. So in that context, how does a leader build a connectivity with the people they are leading, where there's a degree of empathy for what they're going through? Well, I also observe as some leaders really thinking hard about what are the skills people are bringing and how can they be used in different and encouraging ways. But at the heart of it is, how does a leader adapt, and how does a leader encourage people to adapt in these circumstances? Two examples from outside this country. I work with a president of a theological college in Canada, and they've had to do all their teaching online. They've had to completely alter a lot of the curriculum. And what the principal there has brought is a very positive approach of seeing it as an opportunity to do distance learning, which had not been thought of very seriously before. And another example of somebody I worked with in Australia, where it's been, how does she develop the skills of people in new ways? So they are thrown by the circumstances, but their concern has been to enable courts to operate virtually, to be able to ensure that proceedings are actually quicker than they have been before. So it has been an opportunity. So leading well, I think, for people in each sector, is about clarity, communication, building connectivity, and being adaptable.
I should probably begin by saying that what really gives me authority to lead on a discussion on how to lead in crisis is all the mistakes that I've made in crises. But I noticed that the image our comms department chose for this seminar was that of the lighthouse. That reminded me not only of my childhood ambition to be a lighthouse keeper, but also one of the places where I learned something about managing crises as a member of a lifeboat crew. What made me feel totally safe in the very worst storm and crisis was an outstanding coxswain. Great training for the role of an archdeacon in many ways. It can feel a little bit like being the diocesan crisis department. But in 24 years of church leadership, I've never known a crisis quite like COVID-19. Bishop of London said last week that it's 800 years since churches last closed their doors and withdrew sacraments. So how on earth do we lead in a time of crisis like this? I'd like to provide a springboard for my conversation with Peter by reflecting on 10 lessons that I learnt as a junior member of a lifeboat crew, and perhaps have subconsciously helped me in times of crisis. And the first one has been to face a crisis head on. When you suddenly face a force 10 gale at sea, and they can happen very suddenly, there's a great natural temptation to turn away, to try and avoid it. Any sailor knows that the only safe way into a storm is at 90 degrees, is head on. When we consider the ministry of Jesus, it was very much in his character to face things head on. Indeed, we might consider the temptations right at the beginning of the ministry, facing them head on. Most crises that we face often happen very suddenly, and there's a temptation to try and avoid them, to face away. My sense is that it's those who face into it who have most chance of riding the storm. Peter, in your experience of working with leaders in so many capacities, what are the most impressive ways in which you've seen leaders facing into crises and riding the storm?
When Matt Baggett was a police chief constable, and he was a Christian, his approach as a Christian leader was to approach decisions in this sort of way. He said, I reflect on what needs to be resolved. As a professional, I get the right team around me and encourage honesty and plain speaking. I'm conscious of my frailty. He wrote, I try to find time to put the issue before the Lord. I trust that the Lord lives within me and that I won't hang on to things that will deflect me. And to me, that was a wonderful example of a Christian in a situation, regularly facing crisis, drawing on all his professionalism and getting the right people around him and having that trust in the God who lives within him. What I've observed in working with people over recent months is the absolute need for honesty about issues, the importance of dialogue with key people and ensuring you're triangulating all the time, and not operating alone, plus the need for a pretty thick skin when those around you want to complain. I was working with a couple of people this morning for whom the thick skin was absolutely crucial at a time when they felt beleaguered, even bullied by those around them. And I think for any leader in time of crisis, particularly so in a pastoral context, a thick skin is probably one of the most necessary skills that are needed. Plus, finally, this willingness to keep learning from what's gone well and what's gone less well.
That's really helpful. I think I've been good at pretending I've got a thick skin, but frailty, honesty, thick skin leads me on to a second learning, which is about being aware of the emotions generated within you. 20 miles out in the Irish Sea on a dark February night at 2:30 in the morning, it's lumpy, and with every wave, the boat rises 15 feet and then crashes, and your heart echoes this movement. It's actually really terrifying. I often reflect on the broom tree that my first parish gave me as a leaving gift. I don't think they realised the significance of it. But it was, of course, under a broom tree that the great prophet and leader Elijah slumped and wanted to die after Jezebel was after his blood. We're all affected emotionally by crises. They're scary. They're usually unknown territory, and human beings are great at catastrophizing. We quickly think about all the negative things that could happen in this situation. And in 3 or 4 what ifs, we're doomed. Peter, you work with a huge variety of leaders, some of whom perhaps find their emotions more difficult to manage than others. What do you think are the most helpful ways in which we can keep calm in a crisis and keep those emotions in check?
I'm very conscious when I do coaching conversations at the moment that I need to just find out where people are emotionally and what are the dominant emotions they're experiencing, and then work with that. I think for us, we're going through a range of different emotions. There'll be high points. There'll be moments when we think there's been a breakthrough, but there'll also be low points as well. And I think it's how best do we spot an emotion before it overwhelms us? How much do we see an emotion as early warning, as really good data? That when we begin to feel frustrated or angry or resentful or irritable, to say, I'm beginning to feel irritable. What is that telling me about the situation? What is that telling me about me? And how best I slightly move into a different place. And also, when you feel an emotion, you may be mirroring the emotion somebody else is experiencing, and it can give you data about them as well as about you. So it's almost being able to just sort of observe your emotions, stand back for them, treat it as data, and then as far as possible, not let the emotions derange your judgment or detrimentally affect your judgment. Hence the importance of who are the partners you talk things through with. Often difficult in a parish because who is your colleague you can talk things through, frankly, honestly, drawing out the emotion to help triangulate how best to interpret yourself and the situation.
That's really helpful, and it touches on some of the work that we did in the clergy wellbeing launch just a few weeks ago. But it's also a segue into my third point, which is about looking after yourself as a leader. I think it's probably changed by now, but when I was a lifeboatman, there was a perk to being a coxswain. You were the only member of the crew to have suspension in your seat. It was a little privilege which wasn't afforded to the other crew members. but it recognised the need to make sure that the leader was looked after. If he or she goes down, then that can lead to another crisis. In Luke 5:16, we read that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed, and often when there were plenty of crises going on around him. I've learnt, sometimes the hard way, that we need to look after ourselves in times of crises. Obviously, crises demand more of us, more mental energy, longer hours, increased anxiety, etc. But all that's the more reason to make sure that we're able to operate at capacity. It's easy for diet, sleep, and physical exercise to go out of the window. But we recognise that these are the things that keep us strong and healthy. Peter, you must have seen good and bad practice in terms of leaders caring for themselves in crises. Tell us a little about what healthy and unhealthy leadership looks like from this perspective.
Now, this comment may not feel a helpful thing to say, but it seems to me that looking after ourselves as leaders is our responsibility and nobody else's. We carry the responsibility to look after ourselves. If we begin to blame others for our misfortune, that's our problem and is something that it is right to be wary of. But what I observe working well is seeking to build rhythms that work for you. There is no obligation to work 24/7. There is a duty that we have to seek to find a pattern that works for us. So what are the rhythms that work for us? What is the exercise pattern that works for us? I often use a phrase, shaft of stillness. How can we pinch the smoker's trick of 5 minutes just to go outside, walk around? Maybe once every hour, once every 2 hours, just putting in a shaft of stillness where we turn the brain off and allow our minds and bodies to relax. And often I say to people, if they're in a very busy time, what else are you doing other than working? What else is catching your curiosity? Is it with your kids? Is it with a sport? Is it with an interest? And often those who I observe carrying responsibility well are those who are doing something as well as work. That may be physical, may be intellectual. And finally, what is key is that support of key friends, about who are the trusted others who one can talk things through frankly and openly with. And it's a never-ending journey to try and get this balance right of looking after ourselves. It always feels like 3 steps forward and either 2 or 4 steps back. It's a constant journey that we're seeking to find ways that work for us in different situations. And the solution will be different at different spheres and different times.
That's really helpful. And once again, I see some parallels there with the sort of rhythm of life that we've tried to establish as a diocese in terms of the 5 areas of prayer, work, study, hospitality, and recreation. And I sense that looking after ourselves is key to enable us to fourthly look after others, look after our crew. A lifeboat should have a crew of 7. It legally can't launch without 6. So it's actually saying the leader cannot be on his or her own. And it's the coxswain's job to look after the crew and to use it to its full potential to navigate the crisis. The better they care for the crew, the more motivated and effective the crew will be. The better they enable the crew, the more the crew will grow in confidence and ability. Jesus models the way in which formation of leadership happens. Disciples are trained, not born. They demand care, investment, and time. And sometimes in my own experience, I found that the small things make a big difference. When the cox turns around and throws you a Mars bar, a word of affirmation at the right time, taking calculated risks and increasing responsibilities. And I sense the way that we manage our teams can be the difference between whether we survive a crisis or not. Managing them well can see you through a crisis, enabling everybody to grow. And managing a team badly can backfire and leave you at risk of capsizing. Peter, we hear a lot about good collaborative leadership. What does that look like at a time of crisis? How do we care for our teams and manage them in the face of uncertainty?
One lovely example that struck me in recent weeks was from HMRC. I won't quote this because we put it in an article. HMRC collect taxes. And one directorate there was asked to switch from collecting taxes to paying out the furlough money. And they had to devise new schemes of doing it very quickly. And instead of it being a top-down hierarchical approach, they used the experience of middle managers in HMRC to devise the processes. And that was a fantastic bit of team effort with people bringing different skills and different experiences to do something fast. And there have been a number of examples I've come across of where organizations have had to change quickly, and they've used different skills in new ways and drawn out skills of practitioners. Now, the question now is, as we come out of lockdown, how do we capitalize on those skills that have come to the fore? How do we take a team that has been dealing with the immediate into a team that can take forward longer term issues with confidence and capability? How can we be more than the sum of the parts, having been through a grueling but satisfying period?
That's massively helpful. Just to change tack a little, a fifth lesson that I've learned is about taking time to assess a situation. Every crisis is different. You can't use the same strategy for every time you run into trouble. I remember on the lifeboat watching the coxswain when we got into a tricky situation. Often the weather was so bad he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. And I was often feeling, do something. But he took time to gather all the information available to him. Echo sounder, radar, radio, etc. And then would make a careful judgment based on all the information available. I think I said in a reflection a few years ago that one of my favourite prophets is Habakkuk, the one who stands on the tower and watches. He's one of my favourite because I'm not very good at that. And I know that panic has often driven me to a sort of freneticism, a sense that I must act quickly. And we know that sometimes this is important. But I sense not at the expense of not taking that short time to make sure that the action we take is right. I just wonder, and people may disagree, but I just wonder, looking back to the beginning of lockdown, we all acted very quickly. Clergy were frenetically organising online services. And I wonder whether with hindsight, we might have acted too quickly. I wonder whether in that first week, we might all have joined Archbishop Justin around his kitchen table at Lambeth Palace and taken just a little more time to assess the situation and work out how we could go forward together. Peter, is this something that you relate to? Crisis often demands a quick action, but how important is it that we take time to assess the information available to us?
The good rugby referee will walk slowly back from an incident, inviting the offending player to walk back a few paces with them before the referee faces the player. And in those moments, maybe the referee is deciding whether it is a warning or a sending off. Other than in extreme emergencies, there's always time to pause, albeit briefly, and reflect how to respond. I think the most effective leaders I've observed in the last few months are thoughtful and then deliberate, avoiding a sense of panic, as panic is far more contagious than COVID-19. When we want to rush back to previous ways of doing things, maybe we need to think slowly and in a measured way about what is the future journey we feel called to be on together.
I like that image of the rugby referee. I hope David Welsh was listening there.
There were lots of nods from David at that point.
I did do exactly that, so yes.
Yeah, there are rarely occasions in Wales where there's a warning or a sending off needed, of course. The sixth lesson that I learned from my days as a lifeboatman was about changing horizon and reassessing priorities in a time of crisis. When a lifeboat launched, it always did so with a clear task. A yacht has gone aground on a nearby island, and there were 3 sailors on board. They are safe on the island, but they're stranded, and we need to return them to the mainland. En route, however, we come across a young lad in a kayak who tells us that his friend has gone missing. Immediately, the horizon changes and priorities are reassessed. Our goal of returning the stranded sailors remains, but there is now a more urgent task: to find and rescue a young kayaker who's got into trouble. Again, so many incidents in the Gospels where Jesus is uninterrupted by a crisis. It doesn't change his long-term plan, but the urgent momentarily pushes aside the important. All of us will have the experience from time to time of urgent pushing aside the important. I know for clergy, it often happens on a daily basis. In a crisis, this is inevitable. Longer term planning has to be put to one side for the time being as we focus on the shorter term. And this will involve new priorities which need to be worked out. Peter, how do you see people tackling this well?
A lot of organisations are having to go through rescue, repair, and then renewal. And I think what I observe now is a temptation to rush to define the new normal, which is illusory. In many organisations, it is not possible to identify what is going to be best for the future. And we shouldn't beat ourselves up for focusing on the immediate. The urgent has to be tackled. I was working with somebody earlier this morning who was in danger of beating themselves up about not focusing enough into the future, when there are a myriad of things they had to sort out now. And what we discussed was when was the right moment to begin to focus on the future, when certain factors would be clearer. The risk is we're feeling inadequate about dealing with the present and the future. And perfectly reasonable to say certain things about the future have to wait till September. Then it can be a priority. And then the question is, who is in the room with you when you talk about the future? About not taking it all on your shoulders, but who are your colleagues with whom it is right to be dialoguing about the future, so there is a width of perspective, so that there is a prioritization with a boldness of aspirations, but a realism about what is deliverable.
That's really helpful. And again, a segue into a 7th learning on the lifeboat, which was about listening and communicating well. Communicating at sea when there are noises of the engine, storm, and the boat banging against the raging waves is tough. And so crew communicate by an audio system with headsets. Just like the organs of a body, there is need for nerve-rich tendons connecting each part efficiently and effectively. I sometimes wonder how St. Paul might have used the instruments of the communications explosion in the past few decades. What we know of his use of the medium available to him suggests a strong communication of strategy, even from prison. In any case, crisis, a leader having assessed a situation with a leadership team and articulated new priorities needs to communicate these well. And we know this is part of reassurance, building trust in a strategy, and both including and encouraging people to embrace the strategy. Can you give us some good examples, Peter, of a leader in crisis communicating a strategy well? What are the things that we need to think about in relation to that?
One of the consequences perhaps the most dramatic consequence of COVID-19 has been that many organisations have improved their communications dramatically. Leaders have become much more attuned to briefing through Zoom or other virtual means and using electronic means of communication. Some of the people I've been working with have been talking to tens of thousands of people at the same time across the world. Much more of a level playing field has been created between people working in different parts of the country or globe. And what I observe about leaders who are communicating strategy well is the combination of honesty about the issues, about affirming the contribution of individuals, about seeking to be clear about long-term aspirations as far as possible, and being collaborative in their approach. And also demonstrating they have listened. The days of a very top-down strategy, I think and hope, are dead. It's about how the effective leaders are putting forward a strategy which demonstrates they've listened and heard with a strong sense of a collaboration towards shared aspirations.
That's really inspiring, and I hope that some of that inspiration that you've shared was one of the key values in the design of the parish needs process. And I think we can relate to some of what you've said in the bishop's leadership team as well. I've so valued the way since March that we pray together each morning over Zoom and then touch base with each other afterwards. The communication explosion within the team, I think, has been an enormous blessing. I want to say an 8th lesson, which is massively important for me, is about remaining hopeful. When you've been searching for a small vessel in the vast ocean, looking for a needle in a haystack in the most awful weather, and you get hungry and tired, it's easy to begin to lose hope. Experience has taught me that it's often when you're at the point of giving up that a sighting emerges on the horizon or a new lead is made known. One of our greatest commodities, of course, as Christians is hope. I was delighted to come across a young religious community last year who've called themselves Hope Weavers. There must be a purpose for them in the world. What a wonderful name for a Christian community. One of the most important tasks of a leader must be to remain hopeful when others are losing it. That's not a blind hope, but a confidence in the strategy that has been adopted, a recognition of the necessity of ongoing energy and motivation, and a genuine belief that all shall be well. How important, Peter, do you think it is that a leader maintains and models a sense of hope in crisis? And where have you seen this be effective in your experience?
I think what effective leaders are doing is getting this difficult balance right between utter realism on the one hand and not hiding the problems, and on the other hand, a sense of the possible going forward. And where they do that well, they're picking up signs of hope, of previous barriers and prejudices being eroded, of people working together more closely than ever before, of opportunities that have opened up that can be built on, of previous ways of doing things that were thought impossible to change being changed. Lots of people have talked about more radical change in the use of technology in 3 weeks in March than had happened in the previous 3 years. Developments like all the parole board hearings being done virtually, judgments in the appeal court hearings written more quickly, lots of signs of hope. And what is key is that when we talk about signs of hope, they're not just wishful thinking. We're seeking to root them in signs and evidence of progress, maybe drawn from elsewhere, so that there is a realism when we're talking about opportunities in the future, so that we are taken seriously and people will combine together to think about what are the aspects that can be built on constructively going forward.
And perhaps we have to be hope weavers for each other at times too, because inevitably there are times when, like Elijah, we do want to give up. But I suppose that's when friends and community are key. Coming to an end, ninth, I want to say that I've learnt about being aware of limitations. One of the most difficult aspects of serving on a lifeboat was when we really recognised that something was impossible. That didn't happen very often, but I have known a Cox to say that he's not prepared to risk the lives of 6 crew to do something which has extremely little chance of success. It's often one of the most difficult decisions to make. And for church leaders, I wonder whether that might occasionally be about avoiding messianism, the belief that you really do have the gifts and mission of God himself and actually are capable of saving the planet. And if none of you have fallen into that trap, then I can confess that there are times when I have. Peter, how do we recognise that we've done what we can and it's time to realise that we can't do any more, or without great cost to us or those we work with?
I think there's a moment when all leaders have to step back for a period. Adrenaline has flowed, and that has taken us a long way forward, but none of us can go on relentlessly pushing ourselves forward remorselessly. The emergency services put people on shifts so individuals are not exhausted and have chance to rebuild their energies. And in government, I've seen a number of examples recently where people were working very intensively, 14 hours a day for 6 days a week, where they are now having a break and others are moving into those roles, much more use of people switching into roles after a period. I think in the church context, we are very traditionally bad at allowing people to slow down and stop. We tend to expect our church leaders to keep going until they drop with our never-ending set of expectations. So there are moments when we need to, and we need to allow other people to say enough is enough and say we've done our best, and we need to be allowed to stop and reframe our approach to next steps without the burden of other people's expectations beating down upon us.
I agree. That's a particular danger in the church, which feeds all sorts of nasty heresies like Pelagianism and has all sorts of health warnings attached. I want to say that my final lesson is about the need to keep learning and adapting. One of the most inspiring elements of serving on a lifeboat was serving under a leader who set a culture of always learning and adapting. New situations always emerged both in training and rescue, and he would help us to use the skills that we already had to adapt and apply to a new situation. So we haven't worked with a helicopter to put a member of the crew onto another vessel before, but we have worked with a chopper in a similar context. How do we apply what we learned in that context for this situation? He also taught us to learn from our mistakes. They could be some of the best and most expensive lessons, so they shouldn't be wasted. Discipleship is all about learning. Jesus called the 12 to be learners, and didn't they make some spectacular mistakes? And not always just the once either. And yet somehow all in the end was harvest. Peter, what do you see as some of the most effective ways that we can ensure that we keep learning and adapting?
I think, firstly, we learn far more from what goes wrong than what goes well. Although in the moment when something's going well, we certainly don't want to be thinking about what we're learning from it. I think it is worth us all asking ourselves on a regular basis, what have I learned this week about myself and about how people and teams react in particular circumstances? For some, keeping a log of learning is helpful. For others, having a trusted colleague or mentor who you can share experiences with is an effective way of seeking to crystallize your learning. We are reinventing ourselves all the time. And there is a risk that each of us describes ourselves as the person we were a year ago or 5 years ago. And I think the experience of the last 4 months has changed each one of us on this call. And maybe it's a good moment to update our narrative of who we are as a leader, to take account of the experiences of the last few months, be they bruising or inspiring. But there's a moment to do this and a moment not to do this. I'm very conscious from a conversation yesterday that a couple of people were feeling so bruised, it was not the moment to crystallize their learning from a very painful period. That had to wait. But there is a moment when, however difficult the period has been over the last 3 months, it's right to say, and what did I learn? And how has that experience altered the narrative that I bring as a leader? And therefore how I would want to enable others to sustain their leadership contribution in difficult situations.
Peter, thank you so much. You have given us an enormous amount to think about from your vast experience of working with leaders across the world. So what I'd like to do now is, this was a humble offering from me of 10 things that I've learnt about leadership in crisis, embellished with Peter's vast experience. 10 lessons. Face the crisis head on. Be aware of the emotions generated within you. Look after yourself. Look after your crew. Take time to assess the situation. Change your horizon and reassess your priorities. Listen and communicate well. Remain hopeful. Be aware of your limitations and keep learning and adapting. So I think there's a really good question which Sue has asked. Sue, do you want to? Can we unmute you?
Can unmute me? My question was actually, are we making this harder for ourselves by calling it a crisis? Because crisis to me so often implies it's short term and I'll just put my head down and push through, and which is kind of what we've been doing in this period. But actually this is a much more chronic situation, in the sense of we're going to be in this socially distanced weird church world for months. And if we keep calling it a crisis, then my response is to just keep pushing through rather than chronic and perhaps being a little bit more balanced. Thinking about that whole self-care and balance question.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant contribution, actually. And what I'm hearing in relation to that is the person who said to me, "We got to be prepared for a marathon, not a sprint here," which, as you say, has implications for self-care. Peter, do you want to say something in response to that?
What irritates me more than anything else is the media coverage of everything's a crisis, which means there's no scaling. It's all a crisis, and therefore there's no differentiation at all. We are clearly now in this for the long haul. The social distancing stuff is not, I suspect, going to go away. And we've had this breakthrough in terms of maybe is it a third or fourth technological revolution? And we either go with the flow of that and use it to best effect, or we go back to living in mud huts. You know, it's sort of that dramatic as some of the things that have been happening. So I don't want to, as it were, use a word that underplays the significance of what is happening. But crisis is a much overused word which has no differentiation now.
Thank you, Sue. That was really good. Really good question from Chris Besant. Chris, do you want to Do you want to, can we unmute Chris?
Yeah, great.
There you are.
One of the things that sort of pretty much immediately came to my mind was that, and I'm sure many of us would agree, is that PCC is not the right shape for managing, you know, the immediacy of the issues that we've had to face. And so I didn't really have a regular standing committee and this type of thing. You know, we've just sort of had you know, me and the church wardens and a few others. So I just really went round the church and thought, right, who do we need for this? And I just handpicked everybody, pretty much threw them all in a Zoom meeting and said, right, I'm giving us all permission to sort of, you know, write a new management chapter for at least a while for the church. And that's been extremely effective. And I would add to that everybody else who sort of was on the PCC or any, you know, who might have reacted and said, well, what about us? You know, have been very, very good about it. You know, explained everything, made sure that we were an agile team, and that's been very successful. Just a comment really, rather than a question.
Can I pick up two things about that, Chris? The great thing was that you did not take it all on your shoulders. You said, I need a group of people where we can jointly own this. And you put a lot of emphasis on communicating with the other people in the PCC. So they knew why you were doing this. So they had the rationale for putting together this team who could do the forward planning. And actually, in governance terms, it's often useful if it is not the PCC that does it. So the PCC can act as a sort of, as a check, as it were, with the work being done by a group. So much to be commended on your clarity, your communication, and not taking it all on your shoulders.
Right. I think the other thing I'd want to add to that is something about Chris's context. I'm very aware of those who've sort of begun new ministries, you know, relatively short period before lockdown happened, or even have been licensed since lockdown. And I think that demands, you know, doing things in an unusual way, and people need permission to do that. Really helpful contribution from Pippa about hope, framing thinking. I don't know whether other people have experienced sort of leaders who are pessimistic and leaders who are optimistic. I think I'd reiterate Peter's earlier comments about realism, which is really important, but it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to work under leaders who don't have that sense of optimism.
Can I pick up from Pippa this point about creativity, celebrating creativity? You know, and almost whenever there is something done slightly differently creative, demonstrating and role modeling that, and seeking other people encouraging other people to build on it. It was interesting, one of our church members sort of suggested that there was interviews in the online services with people who are in the midst of decision making, and Simon readily accepted that, and that became a regular part of the service. So it's sort of picking out and endorsing creative ideas.
A huge thank you to Peter once again for joining us for this webinar. Peter gives very, very generously to the diocese, and we're extremely grateful to you, Peter, for sharing some of your wisdom this afternoon. And to remind you all that our webinar series continues on a Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and next week we'll be thinking about technology for streaming from our buildings. And I'm sure you'll all be encouraged not to rush out and spend lots and lots of money before thinking really carefully about the way that you do this. So thanks everyone for joining us, and hopefully see some of you next week. God bless.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.